Hello, everyone. Here we are at our final summer craft talk. I'm gonna not sit creepily still, but I'm just gonna wait a few minutes for people to come in and populate the space, as I see is happening now. And then we'll start. I was at a Zoom poetry reading last night where the host waited for people to come in for a full maybe almost 10 minutes, and it was very awkward, I felt. So I won't wait 10 minutes.
Was it very sparsely populated, the poetry reading, or?
Not at all. It was actually a pretty big audience. It was quite robust, but
Maybe they were buying time.
yeah, for sure. But to me, it's okay to just chat during that time.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll give it another minute. Okay, we'll start. We are a little sparsely populated here, but it is the very end of the summer. One thing it's important to say is that we're recording. So this will go up on the school's YouTube page and our first year writing page when I get it set up. So hi, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Miller Oberman, the director of first year writing at Eugene Lang, and this is the final of our summer craft lunches. Our next craft lunch is going to be on Monday, September 21st in the fall, when school has started. And yes, you heard that correctly. It's going to be on a Monday. We're having our craft lunches on Mondays this semester instead of Tuesdays for scheduling reasons that are too complicated and boring to mention here. But I hope we'll see you back then. I'm trying to think if there's any more business that I have. I don't think so. That craft talk, by the way, is going to be with Jessica Gross and Kyle McCarthy, both first year writing faculty who have worked together a great deal and helped each other a lot with their work. And I wasn't, it seems like there might be a problem with people getting in. Okay. I wonder if this is something that we can check on. All right. Maybe that can be sorted out. Thank you, Shanaz, for telling us. Yeah, so Jessica and Kyle will be speaking in September, I think, about helping each other edit their work, which will be really interesting to hear. Today, I'm joined by Tara Menon, and we have this extremely broad topic in front of us, reading and writing, which maybe are the same thing, maybe are different things. And so we're gonna just talk for a while and then take questions at the end. So if you have them, hang on to them and then type them to us in the Q&A session or in the chat window. I think we can see them in either of those places. So I'll remind you of that probably around 1:15. And until then, we will just start talking. So it seems like we have a login issue. All right. We're going to just move forward and hopefully we'll get sorted out. Yeah, so Tara was just telling me about a recent article, which I will mention and try to pronounce this fake word properly, which I can't believe this didn't come up when we were talking before this because it seems relevant. But it's called Forging Bhakti, Translation, Conversion, and Fraud in Azurvaidam. Did I say it the fake way that you said it?
The fake way I said it was Yajurvedam.
Ayurvedam.
Yeah.
Um, will you just say what that is about because it's fascinating?
Yeah, I'm really interested in false translations, that is, translations of things that don't exist, that is, original texts that are pretending to be translations. And this is a fake French Veda, that is, a French Jesuit creation of a Hindu religious text, probably for purposes of conversion. That is, if I want to convince other people, Hindus, to be Christians, say, I could make a fake Hindu text, convince people that it's actually Hindu, and then embed within it ideas of Christianity, right? To begin to convert these recalcitrant people. The issue is that Hinduism is not actually that text-based as a religion. So, yeah.
Yeah.
We have a correct meeting ID identified by, I believe, Shanaz signing in as Rallo. So.
This is the first time this has happened.
Oh, this is Rallo, actually. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hi, Rallo.
Hi.
I love everyone identifying themselves from each other's. No, it's good.
No, this is good. Yeah.
Teague, if these were sent out by email, I don't know if there's anything you can do to alert someone to send out the right one, but if it's possible, that would be great. If not, then people can watch after the fact. And we'll just be very intimate here in our Zoom. So when was this? I love the miscalculation of let's make this text thing for this thing that's not as text based.
Yeah, it's a 17th century text. The really funny thing about it is that the original in French was presented as a translation, and it kind of ended up in Voltaire's hands. And Voltaire was the arch enemy of the Jesuits. And it had the complete opposite effect. Voltaire read that and said, wow, look at this ancient wisdom. It has all the good things about Christianity with none of the bad things, like none of the ritual encumbrances or none of the guilt, etc. And so he says, so it ended up having the effect of kind of converting Voltaire instead of, I mean, not really, I'm exaggerating, but it did not have any, there's one account of it being received by a Hindu, and it's a story of a Jesuit going from village to village around Pondicherry. And a Brahmin sees this guy trying to convert people with this text that they cannot read. And he gets a stick and chases him, like beats him and chases him out of the village. There's one account of a case like this, but that's it.
I love the way you talk about this research because it sounds like this great story.
It's absurd. Yeah, it's a really absurd story.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's funny that this didn't come up when we talked, because when we talked, it was like, okay, reading and writing. And we started from this place where I said, maybe we can think about times when what we read really influenced something that we wrote. And I did come up with something like that I'll share. But what really happened was that we started getting into a conversation about identification and whether our experiences identifying or not identifying with texts and how that changed the way that we read. And this is something that comes up a lot in the classroom because I often, for example, in my class, the queer page, have students come in who say things like, I've never been able to identify myself in a text before. This is the first time, which was also my experience as a young person. I think I was 18 or 19 when I first identified with a character in a text in any way as similar to myself or my own experience. And yet I loved reading, right? So we're not rejecting text, and we're not rejecting reading, and we're not rejecting writing, even when we sort of disidentify.
Yeah, I remember when I first encountered students saying to me, and this was when I first began teaching as a grad student, students would sometimes say, I don't like this text because I don't relate to it. Or I do like this text because I can really relate to it. And it felt very alien to me because I had never read to relate until
Right.
much later when I found texts that I could relate to. But it wasn't my primary criterion for why I liked a text or didn't like a text. And I ended up saying to those students, you actually make me feel very afraid of you if you need something to be similar to you to like it, you know? Very didactic of me. But yeah, I was just like, I actually genuinely feel afraid if similarity is to yourself is your criterion for assessing a text, your sole criterion.
Yeah. Yeah. If it's the soul, it's hard to relate to if that's not where you were coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder what the word is, the technical word for like fear of one's students.
There must be something like probably German or something like that. Yeah.
Would be German for sure. Yeah. Um, and so then that conversation led us to talking about translation, of course, which I didn't know that you were interested in, and you didn't know that I was interested in. But one of the things that I wound up saying, I think when we were writing back and forth, is that I think that translation is this very extreme example, offers us, and in a useful way, a very extreme example of figuring out what our relationship to a text is or isn't.
Yeah.
Being able to relate, not being able to relate. When we're working as a translator, or aware as we should be of reading a translation, we have to be aware that like everything is translation, right? That we can't understand each other as each other. It's always being filtered through ourselves.
Yeah.
I feel like I was going to ask you a question at the end of that, but I don't know if there was one.
Yeah, I used to assume that translation required a kind of sympathy with the text. But recently I was reading Emily Wilson's translation of Homer, and I loved how much it was at odds with the text. And that's something Wilson talks about too, about the kind of, I think she calls it an intimate alienation or something, of translating this text that has only been translated by men so far. There's a very clear idea of how Homer should sound in English, and Wilson just disrupts that completely. And I love how much that translator is arguing with the text. And I feel like it pushes against the idea that you hear so much that, and that students, I feel, get told so much. I certainly was told it as a student, which is you are what you read, basically. As a writer, you are what you read. And I always feel a little bit uncomfortable with that idea, you know? As a very omnivorous reader, I don't want to be what I read. But when you're translating, you kind of have to be what you're reading. But you can be uncomfortable with that too. And that can produce really good results.
I love that idea of being of that discomfort as a place to sort of just be. That what you were just saying about Emily Wilson, and I haven't read her Homer, but it really reminds me of why I started translating Old English poetry, because I was like, who's translating this? Who's reading this? It seemed to me to be very conservative, religious, white, cis, straight male dudes, you know? And I was like, why should you get to be the only one to do this? And like, what would other people see in it? And there is like a sort of ongoing kind of revolution within medieval studies around race, which is continuing to like really change that field. There's an amazing scholar named Nair Otaño Gracia, who's a Puerto Rican medievalist scholar, and a brilliant. She calls herself. What does she call herself? She calls herself a like radical academic. She won't just even call herself an academic, but she has done this amazing work of map making around the Middle Ages and in terms of the Arthurian legends. And what she noticed was that it seems so obvious once it's said out loud, but it never occurred to anyone because everyone was white. who was doing the work, she basically just, all of the work tracing the way that Arthurian legends moved around the world was done in one directionality, right? It was done in terms of how did this affect Spain? How did this affect North Africa? How did like these Arthurian legends affect these other cultures? But of course, like people were bringing things back with them. And so there's Arabic in Arthurian texts. Like there's all of these other languages being brought in them. There are people of color depicted in these texts. And like no one traced the other directionality. And so she like drew these other maps showing the movement, and like nobody wanted to hear it, right?
That's
And
amazing.
yeah, so it's really interesting, like what happened, like thinking about identification and disidentification. But people will fight so hard, right, for their right to be the only one to identify with a text.
Right, yeah. I mean, the funny thing about the Wilson translation is that the first line that many of you may know of the Odyssey, which is always translated as like "Speak to me, muse of the man of twists and turns" or whatever. I'm probably gobbling. Just becomes "Tell me about a complicated man,"
Mm-hmm.
right? But that sounds much more. I mean, these were oral texts, and that sounds much more. Like that's how epic was spread, and that sounds much more oral spoken in our. So there's a kind of truth to the original also, which is necessarily complicated in Wilson's version. Miller, I loved hearing or getting to read your translations, and I was wondering whether we could.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll read them. See, I think you'll appreciate the fact that I have pieces of paper in front of me.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah. So I'll read, shall I read the more Carpenter-ish translation? Which is probably the poem in my book I hate the most, because I was so unsatisfied by my translation. So I was trying to translate this poem, Wolf and Aidwalker, which is a short Old English lyric, one of only probably two poems in Old English written in the voice of a woman, which you can tell by grammar in like 3 words. And it's very open-ended grammatically and lyrically, and people just put a narrative on it and pretend they can translate the poem, but you really can't. So I tried to translate it for 3 or 4 days, and I wouldn't do this, but I resorted to things like reading every scholarly article ever published about the poem, which usually as a translator I wouldn't do with a poem. Because I don't want people to tell me what it means. I want to figure out what's on the page. So here's my like scholarly, what I would call a scholarly translation, but is actually a piece of crap. Wolf and Aidwalker. To my people, it is like a battle gift. They will consume him in violence if he comes. We are unalike. Wolf is on one island. I am on another. That island is fixed fast, cast about by fens. There are carnage-covered men on that island. They will consume him in violence if he comes. We are unalike. My mind suffered woe at Wolf's wanderings. When it was rainy weather, I sat and wept. When the battle-bold one held me in his branches, there was joy in that, but it was hateful to me too. Wolf, my wolf, it is not starvation, but my hopes for you have made me sick. My mind mourns your seldom coming. Do you hear, Aidwalker? Wolf bears our wretched whelp to the wood. One easily cuts that which was never joined, the tale of us two together. I mean, it's very beautiful, I think, even though I'm, saying that it's bad. It's such a beautiful poem, but there's a finality in that translation. You can't help but make it sound like it's a text that you can represent on the page. But my actual struggle trying to translate the poem is in my other version of it, which came after or in the middle of when I was obsessively reading this trilogy by Javier Marias called Your Face Tomorrow, which is about a translator. The main character is a translator who's essentially hired by the British military to observe people and sort of translate what they will do next by their observing. And this character is constantly looking at every single possibility that a person, for what caused an action. And he's obsessed with obsessively using the word or, and it results in these very, very long sentences of possibilities, which, should I read like one sentence from it?
Yeah, great.
Before let's see. This is one sentence from the first chapter of the first book. The violation of a confidence is also this: not just being indiscreet and thereby causing harm or ruin, not just resorting to that illicit weapon when the wind changes and the tide turns on the person who did the telling and the revealing and who now regrets having done so and denies it and grows confused and somber, wishing he could wipe the slate clean, and who now says nothing. It is also profiting from the knowledge obtained through another's weakness or carelessness or generosity, and not respecting or remembering the route by which we came to know the information that we are now manipulating or twisting. Sometimes it's enough just to say something out loud for the air to grasp and distort it, be it the confession of a night of love or of one desperate day or of a guilty evening or a desolate awakening or the drunken loquacity of an insomniac. A night or a day when the person talking talked as if there were no future beyond that night or that day, and as if their loose tongue would die with them, not knowing that there is always more to come, that there is always a little more, 1 minute despair, 1 second fever, another second sleep and dreams. Spear, fever, my pain, words, sleep and dreams. And then, of course, there is interminable time that does not even pause or slow its pace after our final end, but continues to make additions and to speak, to murmur, to ask questions, and to tell tales, even though we can no longer hear and have fallen silent. So that was one sentence.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I think I worry actually that after that, like reading that almost takes something, like my poem seems so stolen now. But yeah. So here was what I wasn't thinking about that text when I wrote this, I'll just say, but I was reading it. And I think it's really interesting example of how rhythms that we read can kind of affect our work. Wolf and Walker. The poem is either about a woman separated from a man by a petty tribal war, or about a woman forced to live with a second man because of a petty tribal war. Either way, she bears a child. Either way, one man is kept prisoner on an island guarded by bloodthirsty swords. Either way, the woman sits crying in the rain, sheltered by trees, or it could be the rain is crying, or it could be there is no rain, she's only using it as an image. The second man, who is not the island prisoner, whose name means possession watcher, comes to the woman to protect her or imprison her, or because he wants a woman just then and so fucks her. This feels good to her because she's lonely, or likes a good fuck sometimes, or because she loves the second man, not the first. But afterwards it sickens her, out of loyalty to the imprisoned man, or because the second man seemed pleasing at first, but then less so. The child is sent to the woods to die or kill or escape with the island man who may have got free of the bloodthirsty men or stuck them with their own swords. Then there is either an eagle or a cruelty, or cruelty to the woman has always seemed inseparable from eagles, or the one who copied her poem suffered from partial blindness and wrote the wrong word entirely. Certainly sharp-edged things, carnage, slaughter, or the island was only an image and there was never an island. She only meant we seemed so distant from each other, we might as well be on two islands separated by a hard, salted sea, and neither of us shipbuilders. In this case, there were no islands, men, or swords, but instead a hopeless separateness, ending in a wood full of wolves, or a man called Wolf. And though she has known hunger, it is not hunger that carves her belly with dread, but longing for a man or child or wolf, because it is easy to separate that which has never been joined, meaning the second man has no true claim on her, or the first, or the life of the child in the woods is worth less than the frost of breath hanging briefly on a cold night, soon eaten by the cold. And when it disappears, who is to say then what it meant, what form it had, whose mouth released it thoughtlessly, or perhaps looked at it and knew how small a time its form would hold against the night?
Thank you. That was really amazing. And I liked when we were talking about how things we read make accidental incursions into our writing. Like the shape of that poem as coming out of the Javier Marias thing, but being radically different and moving in a very different way. The Marias, I almost said poem, sentence, really makes me as a reader impatient and anxious, whereas the length of your poem sentence like makes me really feel the sharp edges of all the things you mentioned, and eagle or cruelty, and that range of choices, all of them so bleak, it's
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting how open-ended texts can be, because every time we enter them, we're grappling with who they are and who we are, and all of these distances, like the identifications and disidentifications.
yeah
And like I was thinking, of course, like translating that text of all of the people who had translated it before, were they feminists? Like who were these people and what was their reasoning? Because I think as a human being, we know that people put so much crap on us. That's not right.
yeah
And thinking about that being done to texts is very disturbing. I think, especially coming at texts as a person who experienced so little identity sharing in a text. Does that make sense?
yeah it very much does. I mean, I was thinking about how the thing you said earlier about how reading is a kind of writing, that is, readers write their text, the text that they read, and translation is a kind of literal version of that. Like we're all bringing so much to everything that we read, and I hadn't thought of it in the way you describe it now, as imposing things on others, and that puts it in a more disturbing light. But I was thinking about the generosity. I don't know if you read Danny Laferriere's novel called I'm a Japanese Writer, 2008 novel. Danny Laferriere is a Haitian writer.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I thought I'd read a sentence from that to talk about how your readers are your writers, which can be a terrifying thought if you have a bad set of readers or a cruel set of readers, But Danny Laferriere says, when, years later, I myself became a writer and was asked, are you a Haitian writer, a Caribbean writer, or a Francophone writer? I would always answer that I took the nationality of my reader, which means that when a Japanese reader reads my books, I immediately become a Japanese writer. Right? That's kind of a fantasy of becoming as a writer. Like, obviously, you can't just become a Japanese writer when you have a Japanese reader, and the Japanese reader may be reading you for you to not be a Japanese writer also. But I did really like how that described the way when you put a text out into the world, its readers are going to make it also.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you can never, I mean, it speaks to the distances between us too.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that's really, it's like taking reader response to the very extreme.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I wanted to talk actually a little bit about. I remember last, like before the summer, Scott or somebody else asked us to think of our favorite writers, and I was thinking I don't have any favorite writers. But I do have a maybe one. I have a favorite reader,
Mm,
and that might be Coleridge.
mm,
Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, about whom I wrote a portion of my dissertation. And I was thinking about Coleridge's ways of reading and how those ways of reading influence Coleridge's writing, as many, many people have. There's a way in which Coleridge's writing has been treated as a kind of hallowed archive. And really, what it is more like something that I'm somewhat embarrassed of whenever anyone looks at my computer screen. Like, one reason I will never screen share on Zoom is because I have so many tabs open all the time and it looks ridiculous. But that's kind of how Coleridge's writing is, Coleridge's reading. I was wondering, like, whether we think about our reading very differently now that so much of it takes place digitally.
mm,
And Coleridge was really a voracious reader, really a distractible reader. And his relations to texts and textuality had kind of a hyperlink style. But I feel like this style is kind of exalted and legitimized by the scholarly editions in which his work is enshrined, right? Or the physicality of the archive. If you go to a library and you look at the collected works of Coleridge, a lot of it is just fragments from Coleridge's reading. It might as well be my tabs.
mm.
Yeah.
I love that way of sort of like moving through time that you're doing with him. Well, would you read Kubla Khan?
Yeah, sure. We were just talking about how like Kubla Khan ends up layering all these different landscapes into a somewhat short poem. And a lot of people have written about this, like huge books, like forgetting the man's name, but it's a book called that traces the geographies in Kubla Khan.
Mm,
But basically, Coleridge loved reading travelogues, and all of them appear in Kubla Khan. I mean, a lot of them. So the one, well, I'll read it and then talk about it. Going to one of my many tabs. I'm not going to read the whole poem actually, because I think we might run out of time.
I feel that you could read the whole poem, but
Okay, I'm just putting it here if people want to see it, but okay, I will read the whole poem then. Kubla Khan, or a vision in a dream, a fragment, Coleridge says. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedar and cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as air beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast, thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift, half-intermitted burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. And mid these dancing rocks at once and ever, it flung up momently the sacred river. 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And mid this tumult Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maiden, on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Tabora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight would win me, that with music loud and long, I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice. And all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. Thanks for indulging me. I feel like that poem is kind of an allegory of translation, you know, that you hear this thing and then you can build that same thing, except in a different form.
Totally. What's so amazing is like, because that poem is in like the Norton anthology, right? I remember reading that poem as a kid, and being like, oh, I wish that I had an imagination like the imagination that this guy has, right? And I think too, like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is, of course, like his other most famous poem, like just thinking like, oh, I wish I was able to see these fantasies in my mind the way that this person can. But of course, that's not what's going on at all.
No, yeah. He just takes a lot of other people's images and puts them together. So if you look at just the pleasure dome, for instance, the words around it are all taken from, and I'm not talking about Coleridge as a plagiarist, which he's often been accused of being also, and he was. But I know I sound like I want to.
I love that you're saying your favorite reader was a plagiarist.
Absolutely. He was a plagiarist. He tried to make excuses for himself. Those excuses are lame. He also, though, was a really good borrower in a non-plagiaristic style. And I love the different, I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but I love the different ways in which he describes himself as a reader. It's often in terms of bird imagery. And he talks about how he is a library cormorant. And I love this idea of going to a library and kind of just grabbing a book and, you know, diving in, grabbing and gulping a book like a cormorant. I was watching some cormorants recently in Jamaica Bay and thinking of Coleridge. But that mobile dome that Coleridge talks about in Kubla Khan is, I mean, if you look at his borrowings of words, he is referring to 3 different travelogues, right? And he's talking, so that dome is, I wrote them down, I can't remember off the top of my head. In Purchas's Pilgrimage, which he loved, he talks about a Mongol yurt, and some of the language is taken from that. So that dome is a Mongol yurt, which would make sense for Kubla Khan, just at the moment when Mongols are going from being nomadic to establishing themselves in one place as a kind of empire. Then he also borrows from Major René's Memoir of a Map of Hindustan. And this is a text in which he talks about Amarnath, the cave of ice. And so that's another place in the Himalayas that enters into this text. And then he talks about Reverend Thomas Maurice's, he reads, and you can see in his notes, Reverend Thomas Maurice's Hindustan, in which is all about how the Garden of Eden is in fact Kashmir. And that appears throughout, like the language of that appears throughout this poem. So I just feel like the readerly borrowings that happen there like construct their own new miracle of rare device, which is that poem. Yeah, I don't really have that much more to say about it, but I do love how he takes his reading and reconstitutes it into this new form.
It's so interestingly about ordering and revision in that sense that you're talking about. Like anything, when you take all of these things, if you take all of these amazing things from all of these various places in text and put them in a single dome,
yeah,
right, it becomes something completely otherworldly and impossible and magical. Whereas really, like those are just places.
Yeah, those are just places described fairly flat-footedly by other people.
Yeah.
I feel like that mobile dome is a space of encounter, kind of like Paul Celan's meridian that he talks about in the 1960 Vishnu acceptance speech. It's both a measure of distance and a site of connection. Like I have written down, so he talks about the great, I'm quoting Celan, the great circle of the celestial sphere which passes through the terrestrial poles, the zenith of a given place on the Earth's surface. So this is a kind of schematic linking of places terrestrial and immaterial. So again, I'm reminded of the map making project that you were talking about, Miller, just now. That cartographic construct kind of exceeds itself.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And Celan, of course, was so interested in language itself also.
Yeah.
Like there's a poem of his that I'm obsessed with, a late poem called Line the Word Caves, that begins line the word caves with panther skins.
That's beautiful.
Which is so ridiculously beautiful. That's translated, of course, from the way that Celan used German, which we almost can't call German. Line the word caves with panther skins, widen them hitherto and hitherfro. And then he's like just making a word into a cave and like making it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Amazing.
Is amazing. Like the idea that you take your word and you hollow it out and make it into a place and adorn it. There's something that very much that has in common with your reading of Kubla Khan.
Yeah, and you adorn it with other people's skins that you've hollowed out, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what a panther skin is.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's so fascinating about Celan in this way, which I'm sort of obsessed with, is that he like completely rejected his family who were Orthodox, and he like rejected Judaism, but he was also, his entire education was a Jewish education. And that way of reading text is like quite Talmudic.
Right.
Like, you know, the ancient Jewish texts are like, you know, a book with like somebody's notes and then another rabbi's notes on those notes, and it just goes endlessly. And while he rejected the religion, he completely was made of that way of reading.
Right. Yeah. Like even in the air, right? That poem in the Luft. Celan talks about how the terrestrial rounds itself like clenched earthy, both breath and clay. And that feels very Talmudic. It feels like an allusion to that scripture, that body of scripture. By the way, that kind of commentarial tradition is how I like to think of the somewhat aggressive Isur text that we were talking about in the beginning. I feel like it's just commentary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's a cruel reading, maybe it's an aggressive reading, but it does require careful reading of Hindu text to make a fake Hindu text. So it's like bad commentary, but it's commentary.
That's a very generous like way of reading it on your part, I think. But maybe it also just speaks to the fact that even texts whose purpose is the erasure of another text or people or system of beliefs, that even the act of erasure requires an attention.
Yeah. Sometimes.
Yeah.
At least those are the acts of erasure that I think are worth most paying attention to, beyond acknowledging.
Yeah, there's this poem that I was obsessed with. The first Old English poem that I translated that I really translated, is this poem called the Old English Rune poem, which there were no good translations of whatsoever, because it was sort of assumed to be almost this like nursery rhyme. And what this poem though is, it was written by a Christian monk in England who was engaged in the act of what they called at the time depaganization, which was a destruction of the entire pagan history of Britain. And there was very, very, very little left that survived. It was quite a complete effort, unlike what happened in Ireland and other places where a lot of those traditions were saved. In Britain, they really weren't. And like that act is basically preserved in this poem, which takes the runic alphabet and defines it. And it's actually the only reason we have the runic alphabet.
Amazing.
Was through this act of like a person trying to Christianize it. Yeah, it's a fascinating like act of erasure. So I mean, and maybe it's an example just in attempting to like adhere to our theme here of like a kind of reading and writing that are happening simultaneously.
Right. Yeah. Rewriting as acts of reading and writing. Yeah.
Yeah. Rewriting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think for me, it's really hard to imagine writing as differentiated from the act of reading.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I very much agree with that.
I mean, that's yeah. No, you were going to say something.
No, we were talking about different kinds of reading for writing, right? One was the process of identification or lack thereof, or looking for identification. Another was that idea of filtration that you brought up that I really liked. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
It's funny. I've been thinking so much since we talked last week about what you said about Agatha Christie.
Yeah.
Tara was telling me about how much Agatha Christie, like she was surrounded with as a child, and that growing up in India, if you like went to anyone's house, there would just be like the full shelf of Agatha Christie.
Like anyone educated primarily in English, it would be like a lot of Agatha Christie.
And like reading those texts and like trying to filter them through yourself, and how understanding them at that age and then later.
Yeah, I mean, I was sorry, I interrupted you because I think
that's a really good example of like different acts of filtration of text.
Because I was wondering what it was that got me. Like, what do I like about Agatha Christie? I don't like the words on the page. I don't like the sentence construction. None of it appeals to me. The character construction I hate. It's mostly just like racist, misogynistic stereotypes, all sorts of things like that. What do I like? And through that process of filtration, what I ended up with was this idea of plot as kind of lifeline, like the need in a murder mystery for the human sacrifice that is the murder, right, in order to make it compelling. So I began thinking of it as a kind of memento mori also, of thinking about the way it is that murder that draws you on, and the way that the fact of all of our deaths is part of what, the inevitable fact of all of our deaths is what makes it so compelling, even as a light read. It's a meditative exercise, really.
It's so fascinating. Yeah. Because I remember reading them as a kid too, and being like, there's something fascinating about this, but I wouldn't be able to say what it was.
Yeah, I really don't know for sure. I'm sort of stretching
and yet I was compelled to turn one page to the next.
Yeah.
Even though I was like, I had read good things and I knew it wasn't one. Like I had read writing where I could find sentences pleasurable, right?
Yeah.
Like the way that I had, the first paragraph of Moby Dick, like which has its own problems, but it's gorgeous, right? It's beautiful. Agatha Christie has no beauty.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. I was thinking, and soon we're going to see if anyone here wants to ask us anything. But I was thinking about just the identification and disidentification and filtering. And like, I was thinking about, I read this novel called The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall. Have you read it?
I have not read it.
It's like a 19th century depiction of like a proto-trans character named Stephen. who like grows up very wealthy and on a farm and is like different, and it was banned. And I remember reading it when I was probably 19, and Stephen has this horse that's like, I want to say her, but it's like this character now would never be, you would never use that pronoun. But this person's horse, which was like their only friend really, dies. And Stephen is like devastated. And I remember exactly where I was sitting at my friend's apartment reading this. And I was just like weeping uncontrollably because this like character's horse had died. And I was like, my friend came home and found me there, just like, I was hysterical. And I was like, I'd never wept like that reading a book before in my life. And it was like, this isn't the saddest thing that's ever happened. But the fact that like I was able to relate to that character's gender struggle, I was just like, this is fucking devastating. And it's so, the ability to like share in that pain across that time was completely new to me. And like, that's not something you're going to get from Agatha Christie.
No. Or if you do get that from Agatha Christie, I think it's somewhat alarming.
Yes.
Like,
that would be really alarming. Seek answers. But do you remember having an experience like that, like after having read from a place of like not looking
yeah.
for that?
As you were talking about that, no, I don't think I actually have had that. In fact, recently I had a moment reading, I almost never read personal essays, just of my own volition. And I was reading Yun Lee's Dear Friend from My Life, I Write to You in Your Life. And she talks about how she reads to get out of her life, not to relate. You know, she realizes this about herself. And I found that movingly relatable in that way. But it was very recent, maybe last year or something, that I had that experience. But it really touched me.
That's such an amazing title for an essay.
Yeah, and she takes that out of Catherine Mansfield's letter to a friend or lover. Dear friend from my life, I write to you in your life.
It's such an like, again, like an amazing instance of intertextuality, of like weaving these texts together in ways that you wouldn't expect. Yeah. If people do have any questions that they want to ask us and you want to type them up, you're free to do so.
We just asked Shanaz about whether she has had the experience of having something that she's reading infect or sort of transmogrify a text that she was translating. And she had some good examples. Yeah.
Calling on panelists on audience is a bold move, Tara.
Yeah, it's not calling on exactly.
Yeah,
I'm mentioning that it was interesting.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. It's like always, I think what strikes me about like the book the experience I just recounted was that I wasn't looking for that.
Yeah.
You know, it took me so by surprise.
Yeah, they're so different and the effects are so different.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Just like the different things that we go to text for.
And what happens when you carry a text with you, even literally. I mean, I was thinking about whether it was bad luck that I was always going around with Agatha Christie in my bag on the subway or whatever, you know?
Yeah. Shanaz is still typing about thoughts about Agatha Christie. I wonder if there's like, I have not researched this in any way, but I wonder if there's any book of like scholarship on Agatha Christie where people are talking about like reading her as children and disidentification in those texts, because I think that would be really fascinating.
I think there's one that's going to exist. I don't know if any of you know a woman called Brialyn Harper who teaches at Queen's College, CUNY. She is currently working on a book of essays about receptions of Agatha Christie.
That's so interesting. I would read that.
Yeah.
All of those series too are so odd. When we didn't really have YA.
Yeah, exactly. I'm really suspicious of the idea that, I mean, I do think that what you read nourishes you, but I'm very suspicious of I'm suspicious of you are what you eat, but I'm also really suspicious of you are what you read.
Yeah.
Like, yes, of course, we're formed by what we write, by what we read as writers, but I don't think we're necessarily going to take on the problematic stances of various writers that we read. Oh, there's a comment. This is Shanaz writing as Rollo. Okay. I am so fascinated by all the brown characters in Agatha Christie's archaeological dig mystery novels, and increasingly I see the story from their position when I reread. Yes. I mean, previously as a child, when I used to read, I would feel like I was in no one's position. And I would be reading in this very detached way, and everything I read was like water off a duck's back, you know? But I really feel like now, as an older person, as I read, I find myself inhabiting this kind of position. And it makes you look at the text in a very sardonic way. Like, I feel like those characters are mocking the text from within it.
I love that way of thinking about it. I think what you're saying brings up a really wonderful sort of question maybe to ask ourselves in the classroom, is like, where are we when we read this? You know, where do we locate ourselves when we're reading? And I think maybe I don't ask that question enough in a class. Sometimes it's something students volunteer, and maybe I don't ask myself that question enough when I'm reading. Like, where am I? Where am I here? But I love all of the texts too, and I think what Shanaz said here, that like texts that are rewritten from the positionality of a different character too. So much joy in that. I'm thinking about like John Gardner's Grendel,
Right. Yeah.
His autobiography of Red, where she writes from the perspective of the monster instead of Heracles. Like those sort of forays are really fascinating to me for that I think too.
Shana says it's possible to have these multiple tracks of identification when we read. Yeah, absolutely. I read it almost like you are 2 or 3 readers at once.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the more we've read, the more readers we are at once, right? Like, and maybe that's the lesson of Coleridge in some way, that you can be more than one reader at the same time.
Yeah, especially if you let yourself just write in fragments, and it might stress you out. I mean, Coleridge is also delightful to me because he is so good at writing about writer's block. Mm-hmm. Like, he just always has writer's block, is always upset about it. He also, because of the opium, also always is constipated. You know, it's this whole
I feel like everything that you say makes me more interested in Coleridge than I was before.
Yeah. I used to not be interested in Coleridge at all until I started reading these fragments of depressive writing and greedy reading.
Mm-hmm. It is 1:29. Tara, this has been a delightful conversation.
Thank you. This has been such a pleasure.
So grateful to be in conversation with you and talk about these things. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to our lovely intimate audience who was able to get through whatever technical difficulties there were. Shanaz Asrallo, especially. I think that is maybe a good metaphor for what we've been talking about. Yeah. Someone else. Maybe that's the perfect thing to have happened today. Yeah, so we are out of time. And thank you all. And I hope to see you September 21st when we are back. And until then, I hope everyone stays safe and enjoy the waning days of summer if you possibly can.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.